Good evening. This week I'd like to talk about techniques involved in generative music, which is music that basically plays itself. The creator will set up a set of parameters and then the music will play itself for as long as the creator wants to let it run. Now, there are certain techniques involved in this kind of music that can allow you to create interesting soundscapes. And most people think about generative music in an ambient way, but tonight I want to look at another aspect of sequencing using LFOs and sample and holds. So, without any further ado, let's crack on. Now, there are a number of truisms in the modular world. And one of them is you can't have too many VCAs. Now, VCA stands for voltage controlled amplifier, and of course that's perhaps the first place where you might suffer a misapprehension. Now, in the modular world, an amplifier is not necessarily what you might find in the audio world, where it makes things louder. What an amplifier does is it is used to constrain rather than amplify sounds and modulation. Now, if you have a look at the top here, we have an amplifier. Now, generally speaking, the amplifier will be full on. It's only when you start to pull the levels down that things start to happen. For example, what we have here in the first case is a simple LFO feeding into a sample and hold. Now, the sample and hold is being triggered. The LFO shape is the yellow trace on the scope here, and the sample and hold output is the red trace. Now, you can see what's happening is that as the sine wave goes high, the sampled level goes high, and then vice versa in reverse. As we get a low trace, then we get a low output. Now, these could be used as pitches. I'll give you an example of what this sounds like. Now, as it stands, that's not particularly usable. And the reason it's not usable, if you can see these numbers here, it says the maximum is 5 and the minimum is -5. Now, in the Eurorack world, the scale is measured in volt per octave, so that means there are 10 volts, which means a 10 octave range. And when it's, as you can hear, when it's high, it's extremely high. When it's low, it's probably almost inaudible. So what we have to do is to constrain those extremes. And the way we can do that is to use a VCA. Now, as we pull the VCA down, it will pull the pitches into a more usable range. Until we get to about 25%, which I've always found it quite usable. Now, if you think about the full scale being 10 volts or 10 octaves, then if we take that down to about 20-25%, then we're in the region of a couple of octaves, which is very usable. We can go a little bit higher. Or we can pull it down to very low indeed and letting a very small range of pitches through. But as I said, I prefer to leave it around about the 25% mark and let's let it play. Now, if you change the frequency of the LFO, then as you lower the frequency, the difference between the pitches will reduce because it's sampling a slow moving LFO. If, on the other hand, we turn the frequency right up, then the difference between adjacent pitches will be quite large. So again, you can set this to your own taste. If we change the position of the wavetable has changed the shape of the wave. You can see that the wave, the yellow trace, is changing from a triangle through to a saw and eventually to a square. And the corresponding pitches will change accordingly. Now, as always, I'd like to take this a little bit further. So in the next one, instead of just having a basic LFO, which is this second one here, I've put the same LFO that we had the first time with a copy of it. And the purpose of the copy, as you can see, if I turn this little dial down to 0, then we get this wave shape. But what I'm doing here is I am modulating the position to change the wave shape. Now, again, you can see in orange the wave shape. If I raise the dial, then the wave starts to change shape. And that, of course, will have an effect on the pitch. So I'll set it back to 0. Here's and if I turn it up, now you'll notice something different going on here. You see this green trace. This is coming from this LFO, and what this LFO is doing is it's modulating the wave shape of this oscillator, but it's also feeding into a VCA which is modulating the filter cutoff. Now at the moment, again, it's going from a maximum of 5 to a minimum of -5, which means it is sweeping almost the full filter range. And if we turn the filter down slightly, you're losing some of the volume as it gets to the low point. So again, we can feed this into a VCA which will constrain our modulation a bit. And again, that can be quite usable. Now, if we go back to the modulated LFO, that's the wave shape as it stands. If we modulate it with the first LFO, you can see that the pitches are changing. Now, we have a constant rhythm because the trigger is running and feeding a pulse every step. But if you listen carefully, we don't get repeated notes. So that, in a nutshell, is generative music. It's an evolving pattern which changes over time. Now the notes are changing, but also the sound is changing because we're modulating the wave shape and we're also modulating the filter cutoff. Now, the next thing I want to look at is the idea of not only modulating the position of the wave shape, or the shape of the wave, but also to modulate the frequency. And what I've done here is I've got two LFOs. The one on the right is doing all the pitch donkey work. The one on the left is doing the modulation. But what I've done here is I've got a cross modulation going where the pitch LFO is also modulating the position and the frequency of the modulating LFO. And again, as you can see, what we have here is the output of the pitch LFO and the sample and hold trace above it. Now you can see it's moving in all sorts of interesting ways. No longer a sine or a square, but a combination. And if we listen to the effects of that, now I haven't turned up the frequency modulation yet, so I'll do that one at a time. I'll turn up the modulating LFO's effect on the pitch frequency. And if you have a look at the yellow trace again, it's generating an interesting folded wave. Now if I do the same thing and turn up the modulation from the pitch LFO into the modulation LFO, I hope you can hear there that again we have an evolving sequence, but not a repetitive one. Now I've done the same thing over on the other side, where we're taking the filter cutoff and the oscillator wave shape and modulating those with a modulated LFO. So this wavetable LFO here is modulating both the FM and the position of the modulating LFO. So this LFO is having the effect of changing the filter, changing the wave shape, and you can see the green trace. Now what we have in the blue trace is just the sine wave, and the green trace is the effect of that sine wave on the frequency modulation and the position, and it's generating a repeating pattern, and you can see the three peaks. Now that will change if I modulate the frequency of the first one from the second one. And if I change the actual frequency, then we're getting that well-known FM sound. The next one, well, let's have a listen. Now the difference this time is I'm feeding the pitch signal as usual. This is the pitch signal here, the red one. The pitch signal is being fed into an amplifier, but the amplifier is not being triggered. And the reason for that is the amplifier is being controlled by an attenuverter. Now we won't go into the verter part of it because that's an inverter, and that would be taking the sound into the inverse region. So we're going to focus on taking it in the clockwise direction, which is the positive direction. Now at the moment nothing is happening because the attenuverter is switched off, so there is no range in pitch despite the range in pitches displayed on the scope. Now if I turn up the offset, what that does is it expands the range. So we can hear the pitches are now coming into play and have a nice variety about them. What the attenuverter itself does is it starts to modulate. Now you see in the blue trace the effect of the attenuverter. If I pull it down to 0, then it does oscillate, but from a low level. So what's happening, this is what's being fed to the quantizer. So it's a low range of pitches. As we offset, you notice that I haven't changed the attenuverter itself, so it's still bouncing around there, up and down. But what's happened is that the midpoint, if you like, the zero line, has been shifted upwards, which means the pitches are generally higher. And if I take the attenuverter a bit further up, you see the range is now higher. If I pull the offset down, we go back to lower pitches. If I push the offset up, we go back up to higher pitches. Now what's happening is, if the attenuverter is not working, then we have a steady range. If you push the attenuverter up and the offset up, then you have a variable sequence, which again, as you can see on the orange trace as well as the blue trace, is having a decided effect on the generation of random pitches, all within a scale. Now over on this side again, we have the cross-modulating LFOs controlling the wave shape. So again, we have a semi-repetitive sequence, but with built-in variation. If we change in the frequency of the pitch LFO or its modulating LFO, then as you can hear, we have something close to a repetitive sequence, but not. Now the next one brings back my favourite VCA, or my favourite module probably, the Bernoulli Gate. I've spoken about this before. And all that we're doing this time is I'm taking what we had in the last step and adding a Bernoulli Gate to it. Now again, you can mess about with the offset and the attenuverter to change the range of your pitches, the number of octaves that you're working between. If the attenuverter goes up, it broadens the range. If the offset goes down, it lowers the central point about which the attenuverter is oscillating. But of course, that's when you're getting a note on every pulse. What the Bernoulli Gate does is it thins those notes out. And now we're getting a note played round about every 3 out of every 5 pulses, 60%-ish. Once again, these LFOs are modulating the filter cutoff. I can pull it back and do it in an opposite way. So modulating the filter cutoff and the wave shape, which again will generate an evolution in sound. And generative music is all about evolution. Again, by changing the wave position, the wave shape, changing the frequency, we can change the notes that we're getting. And finally, in this section, we have a sequential switch. Now, what I've done this time, I have fed our normal pitch sequence. As you can see, it's going everywhere. I fed a normal pitch LFO into the second channel of a mixer. And I've fed the first LFO into the first channel of the mixer. And the mixer is now being fed into a sequential switch. Now, the first channel and the second channel are being fed by these two LFOs, but the third channel is being fed by a mixture of those LFOs. And as you can see, this is what's going on over here in terms of our pitch. And the sequential switch is being clocked by a slow clock. You'll see the yellow dot moving as it jumps between, and so every time there's a pulse, it will jump to the pitch is generated by one or other or both of the LFOs. So this is what it sounds like. And over on this side again, we have the same situation we've had in every occasion, where the filter cutoff and the wave shape of the oscillator are being modulated by a pair of cross-modulating LFOs. And if I bring in, which I haven't done yet, cross-modulation of FM, we change it once more. And change the direction of the position, so it's moving into more rounded waves. And pull down the attenuverter and push up the offset to narrow the range of pitches. And of course we have a Bernoulli Gate going on, doing its stuff. So if I play the previous sequence, and the one before it, so you have something that is very usable and where the notes are reasonably similar without ever actually repeating a sequence. So, I'll fade that out. And the last thing I want to look at is the ambient scenario, where you're creating evolving pad sounds. Now this time, I'm doing much the same, but the difference is, instead of clocking with an actual clock, what we have here, this little thing here, is a looping envelope. Now you see LP lit there. And what a looping envelope is quite simply that. When it's triggered, it continues to trigger. And when it reaches the end of its cycle, this is just an attack and a decay. So when it reaches the end of the decay, it starts an attack again. Now, the green trace is the actual envelope itself. The blue trace is coming from a slew limiter. Now, what a slew limiter does is it cuts off any rough edges. So there's a rise time and a fall time, and you notice that when we're looking at there's an example there. There's a vertical drop. Now, if you're feeding that into an oscillator, you will get a drop in pitch, an instantaneous drop in pitch. Now, what the blue trace does is it smooths that out to an extent, so you have a less instantaneous. It's still a fast drop, but it's not an instantaneous drop, which has an improved sonic effect. So I'll let you hear how this sounds. Now, because I'm working in software, I can have as many pieces of software as many modules as my computer will allow. So I'm running 3 of these. And if you have a look, we're still using the oscillators, the LFOs, to generate the pitch information. So we still have the sequential switch here. This time I'm going to clock the sequential switch. Every time the cycle ends, it will clock the sequential switch. So I'm going to do that here as well. So this EOC means end of cycle. So every time the envelope reaches the end of its cycle, which would be here, it will send a trigger to the sequential switch, and the sequential switch will move 1 step. And we'll stay here until you see that happening again. There it goes. And I'll do the same with the third one now. Now at the moment you can only hear one of the sounds, so I'm going to fade in the other 2. Now all that's happening here is what's been happening all along. We have the pitch information being generated by a modulated LFO, and the wave shape and the filter cutoff being modulated by a pair of LFOs, except this time I've changed the second pair of LFOs, and we've had the wave shape and the cutoff being modulated by the envelopes. And of course, if you have a long attack and a reasonably long decay happening, then you have that smooth ambient sound that everyone associates with generative music. And what else is happening? There are other little triggers going on. The notes are being played at different times because the envelopes are at different lengths, and the gates are being triggered by the envelopes, so the notes are being fed in. So you hear chords, but you also hear individual notes in the middle of those chords changing. I'll let you listen to a little bit of this. And that little ping that you hear occasionally in the background is just the resonance being tweaked by one of the envelopes. So there you have it. Some of the techniques that are used in generative music. Of course, like everything else, if you're doing it in software, you have unlimited access to all of these things. If you're working in hardware, then you have to be very careful about how you do it and how you approach the acquisition of modules. But as you can see here, LFOs, VCAs, sequential switches are extremely helpful if you want to investigate this kind of music. And of course, Bernoulli gates are absolutely invaluable. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'll be following it up with a piece of generative music using these principles. And I hope to see you again soon. For this patch, I've taken what I did at the end of the last video and I've added a bit more modulation. You see that the attenuverters are now being modulated, and the effect of that is to generate more pitches. The pitch information is coming from a very slow envelope, and so there's a long gate. But the blue trace is showing where the attenuverter is adding extra pitches into what would normally just be a single or perhaps two pitches within the same gate. So that's going to create a lot more pitch movement. Also, I'm doing a lot more modulation of parameters in the oscillators. So I hope you enjoy this patch.